Yes, so I think we're ready to begin now. Uh, Good evening and a warm welcome to everyone here today. We at Primus are delighted to have you join us on what is sure to be a very thought-provoking occasion, the virtual book launch of our new title, Order and Disorder in Early Colonial Bengal, 1800 to 1860, by Professor Ranjan. The book we are here to celebrate today explores the encounter between social restlessness and crime and the colonial state's attempt to control the same. In this insightful work, Professor Ranjan Chakrabarti throws light on representations of criminality that are shaped by power and control. Following the approach of the new social history, which engages with crime and criminality as a social phenomena, Order and Disorder in Early Colonial Bengal not only examines the socio-cultural history of marginalized communities that were presented to be dangerous, but also the popular attitudes and perceptions that colored issues of law and order at the time. Before we move on to the main event, please allow me to introduce our panelists for this evening, beginning with our esteemed author. Professor Ranjan Chakrabarti is currently Professor of History at Jadavpur University and was previously Vice Chancellor of Vidyasagar University, West Bengal. He is a former Fulbright visiting professor at Brown University and has been a recipient of several prestigious fellowships and visiting assignments at SOAS, London University, Brown University, Maison des Sciences de l'Homme in Paris, the Rachel Carson Center in Munich, the Institute for Advanced Study in Humanities in Essen, Sciences Po Paris, Sydney University, and the Forest History Society at Duke University. We at Primus are proud to have published his widely acclaimed books, A History of the Modern World, An Outline, and Dictionary of Historical Places, Bengal 1757 to 1947. Our first panelist this evening, Professor Suranjan, is the Vice Chancellor of Jadavpur University and President, Association of Indian Universities. He was formerly Vice Chancellor at the University of Calcutta between 2008 and 2015. An honorary visiting professor at the University of Exeter, his research interests lie in South Asian history, especially issues relating to identity politics, socio-cultural transformations, and nation building. Primus Books has had the privilege of publishing his co-edited volume, Dreadful Diseases in Colonial Bengal, Cholera, Malaria, and Smallpox, a documentation, and more recently, his edited volume, Gandhi and the Champaran Satyagraha, select readings. Our second speaker, Professor B R Tomlinson, is Emeritus Professor at the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. His latest research interest is a project titled The Empire of Enterprise, Scottish Business Networks and Asian Trade, 1765 to 1832. Professor Tomlinson is also an authority on the political and economic history of modern India, and his books, including The Political Economy of the Raj, 1914 to 1947, Economy of Modern India from 1860 to the 21st century, and the Indian National Congress and the Raj, 1929 to 1942, are all considered important contributions to the field. Our third speaker this evening, Professor Anindita Mukhopadhyay, is professor and head of the Department of History, University of Hyderabad. She specializes in modern Indian history with a focus on cultural identities and intellectual and legal histories. She is the author of Behind the Mask, The Cultural Identity of the Legal Subject in Colonial Bengal, 1776 to 1911, and Children's Games, Adults' Gambits, from Vidyasagar to Satyajit Ray. And she has also translated the works of Rabindranath Tagore and Sarachandra Chattopadhyay into English. Our final panelist, Professor Ronald E. Doel, is Associate Professor of History at Florida State University, where he teaches the history of science and technology as well as environmental policy. He has been associated with several prestigious institutions across the world, including the University of Aarhus in Denmark and the Rachel Carson Center in Germany. He has made crucial contributions in research on the Cold War and international relations, the circumpolar Arctic, and the modern United States. And he is currently working on the rise of the physical sciences in the United States. Now, after all our esteemed panelists have had the opportunity to say a few words, we will open the floor to questions from the audience. So if anyone in the audience has a question for the author or for the discussants, please feel free to leave it in the Q&A box below. And please mention who your question is directed towards. And also please feel free to check the link in the chat box below for a special discount on the Order and Disorder book. Now, without any further ado, I would like to invite all the panelists to release the volume by holding it up to the audience. Thank you so much, everybody. I now invite Professor Ranjan Chakrabarti to introduce his book. Professor Chakrabarti, I'm so sorry, you're on mute. Could you please unmute yourself?
Mr. Bhola Verma of Primus Books. I don't know whether Bhola has arrived. My esteemed colleagues in the panel, Professor Suranjan Das, Professor B R Tomlinson, Professor Ronald Doel, Professor Anindita Mukhopadhyay, Dr. Prasun Chatterjee from Primus, Ms. Jyotika, our anchor this evening, distinguished scholars, colleagues, my dear students, ladies and gentlemen, good evening to all of you. I am grateful to Mr. Bhola Verma of Primus Books for undertaking the publication of the volume. He has all along been, over the last 20 years, one of my esteemed friends. It is always a great honor and pleasure to work with a person like him. He always accepts all challenges with a smile. He has a wonderful personality. Incidentally, all the distinguished panelists this evening are my very close acquaintances. I know all of them long and well, both personally and professionally. It is always a pleasure to work with them, and to them I express my sincere gratitude for giving their valuable time this evening for this book launch program. My association with Professor Suranjan Das, as far I can recollect, goes back to the 1980s, when he was a professor in the Department of History at the University of Calcutta. He has always been a very close friend of mine, and I always enjoyed working with him. Earlier, when I was the Vice Chancellor, I had the pleasure to work with him as one of my fellow Vice Chancellors. And now he is the Vice Chancellor of the university I serve under. With Tom, Professor Tomlinson, a noted scholar and historian of South Asia, my contact dates back to the late 1990s. We had the occasion to work together on many occasions. He was a frequent visitor to Kolkata in the 1990s, and I once had a privilege to act as a local supervisor for one of his PhD scholars who worked in Jadavpur University, Department of History. My dear friend Ron, Dr. Ronald Doel, a leading environmental historian of present times, he gladly agreed to be a panelist this evening and took interest in my book. Thank you very much, Ron, for being with us this evening. And we first, as far as I can remember, Ron, we first met in Portugal when we together taught a course in the University of Porto in Portugal. Thereafter, we have undertaken other projects. Professor Anindita Mukhopadhyay is a very good friend of mine, and we had the opportunity to frequently share our academic ideas about South Asian history, social, economic, and environmental history of South Asia. Thank you, Anindita, for participating in this book launch and kindly giving your consent for launching the book. Order and Disorder in Early Colonial Bengal is an attempt to write a new social history of Bengal with special reference to the exercise of power in various social spaces. And it basically focuses on the nature of British colonial state and its complex ways of interaction with the Indian subcontinent and its people. I was once drawn into this particular subject because I was influenced by the writings of three very radical scholars, namely Michel Foucault. His book Discipline and Punish, the 1975 book in particular. Eric Hobsbawm's two books, Primitive Rebels, the 1959 book, and Bandits, the 1969 book, and Franz Fanon, Wretched of the Ark, the 1961 book. All of them talked about the exercise of power and put forward a critique of that power in some form or other. In the same line, the present book makes an attempt to offer a critique of colonial and post-colonial governance and domination in the South Asian context. The specific research works that helped me to formulate the ideas presented in this book. Special mention may be made of Anand Young's 1985 book, edited book, Crime and Criminality in British India, David Arnold's 1986 book, Police Power and Colonial Rule, Basudev Chatterjee's Crime and Control in Early Colonial Bengal, the 2000 book, the year 2000 book, Radhika Singha's A Despotism of Law, the 1998 book, and Anindita Mukhopadhyay's Behind the Mask, the cultural definition of the legal subject in colonial Bengal, the 2006 book. It is noteworthy in this connection that my interest in the histories of deviance eventually dragged me into environmental history, as many of you know, through my published works. And my switch over to environmental history has actually enabled me to identify new social spaces of domination and subordination. Now, this book, Order and Disorder, it is a 240-page book containing 7 chapters, apart from the introduction and the conclusion. The opening chapter deals with law and order, and the second chapter deals with the policing of the rural society. The third and fourth chapters are on punishment. The colonial perception of crime, dacoity, and rural violence are the main subjects of discussion in the 5th and 6th chapters. The final chapter presents an anatomy of various types of rural violence. Some of the materials presented in this book were published earlier, but this is a new book. I mean, this is thoroughly revised and a new presentation. If you go through the book, you will understand. Students and general readers may find the book interesting, and I think some scholars may also find it interesting and enjoy reading the true stories about bandit heroes from the pages of Bengal's history. I shall not stand between the learned panelists this evening because we have come to listen from them about this book, Order and Disorder. So I stop here. Before stopping, I would again profoundly thank the Primus Books for publishing the book and organizing this interesting webinar, the interesting discussion. And I believe that the discussion will go beyond the book and raise larger issues of South Asian history. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Chakrabarti. Professor Chakrabarti, another book by him is also forthcoming from Primus, Climate, Calamity, and the Wild. And we look forward very much to seeing it published very soon. Before we move on to our panel discussion, I request Mr. B N Verma to please say a few words. Sir, you're on mute. Could you please unmute yourself?
All right. Good evening, everyone, and good morning to Professor Tomlinson and Professor Doel. It's nice to be with you all today, this evening. Anindita, I lost contact with you after you left Shimla. And good evening to you as well. To Suranjan Dash, namaskar. Good to have you back with us. I've read many books, and during the course of my publishing career, several manuscripts on social history, etc. But I have never had the opportunity to deal with a subject like crime and criminality. And there is more to it than what appears from the title, in the sense that we have to look into the philosophy of behind all these problems like crime and criminality. Various issues are involved. For example, the question of marginalization, disaffection with what is happening in the society, suffering, and finance, of course. And I hope that someday Professor Chakrabarti, who's been with us for ever since we started publishing, I hope he will someday take up the issue of criminalization of politics and sports. That's where the money is these days. Having said that, I would also like him to deal with subjects like what exactly is the difference between, say, let's say, theft and robbery, or thievery and robbery, or robbery and dacoity. I mean, these are issues which one has to grapple with in our daily life, especially when we are, in direct confrontation with the law enforcement agencies, etc. So I hope someday he will be able to dwell on these things and take them up and provide us fodder for another book. Now, I don't think it's proper for me to dwell any further on the subject. Let the panelists take on. Thank you very much, Professor Chakrabarti, for allowing us to publish this book, and to the panelists for participating in this evening's event. Over to you, Jyotika. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. Professor Das will join us shortly again. So let us begin the panel discussion, and I invite Professor B R Tomlinson to address the audience.
Right, so I found the unmute button. Well, good evening to you, good afternoon to me. And I just like to begin by thanking Ranjan for the opportunity to take part in a discussion like this, and to the people at Prime Books for organising the whole thing. I was interested to read this book, and I found it very rich and a very good example of what you can do if you immerse yourself in documents and official publications, and also contemporary comments and literature. So there's a great mass of information inside the covers of the book. And all I want to do is to suggest a couple of contexts, if you like, which others may find can use it as a springboard to go off into other areas of research. The first is a context of, it's really an imperial colonial context. And I think there are two issues here. One is that the colonial state in the late 18th, early 19th century is really essentially a very weak state, as is clear from Ranjan's analysis. Lord Cornwallis, who's the most sort of the person who's most concerned to get control of the colonial state, what he's really worried about is corruption by company officials. When he gets to Calcutta in the 1790s, he finds that his predecessor as Governor General and the Commander-in-Chief had invented 2 regiments of sepoys who didn't exist, but he meant that they could then pocket the allowances for themselves. And it's part of this drive to get regulations and rules and laws, and to put the whole basis of British rule on some sort of moral footing. Part of this drive is to try to contain the activities of officials. So the permanent settlement, for example, is the easiest sort of settlement you could possibly have, because Cornwallis and others don't think that local India company officials are capable of administering a sensible assessment, or indeed a non-corrupt assessment. And indeed, many of the officials would like to have a sort of revenue farming, tax farming system, which they can profit from. This notion, this sort of moral notion that access to the law is access to justice, is a sort of basic tenet of that strand of British thought. Cornwallis doesn't allow Indian judges because he thinks Indians are essentially corrupt, but he does allow Indian pleaders. And there is a genuine belief, however misguided, that giving access to the law will give tenants rights against landlords and so on. But laws and regulations, I say, are as much a way of controlling Indo-British fortune hunters as they are of trying to rule. And in general, the first half of the 19th century, all over India, is a difficult time for the colonial state. And David Washbrook has argued that in Madras, for example, this is really a time in which military structures are used to try to create and hold together the colonial state. So we shouldn't be surprised that disorder has a good run in early 19th century Bengal, because the forces of order are actually rather weak rather than strong. It's also perhaps worth considering briefly how lawful 19th century Britain is. I mean, in some remarks in this book, Britain seems to be held up as a model of a society where there is law and where law gives access to rights, and a model which is then imperfectly applied to India. But in fact, early 19th century Britain, it is a fairly lawless place. There are Luddites, there are smugglers, there are Chartists, there are riots, culminating in places like Peterloo. And what law there is in Britain is also biased heavily towards the rural rich, towards landowners and those powerful local society. If you look at E.P. Thompson's work, for example, on the game laws or on gleaning rights, it is clear that the law in Britain is not a sort of a magic regulator for society. And that means we might ask again, what is colonial then about the Bengali situation? I mean, how is it different from the situation in Britain? I mean, part of the answer to that is perhaps about the cultural links between the powerful in society and the rulers of the society. But it's not a simple black and white. The other context in which I'd like to sort of which I try to put some of this work, is really that of Bengali rural society and the economy. I mean, it's very clear from Ranjan's work that crudely the effective power in the countryside belongs to the Lati and to the man who pays the Lati, who is the Zamindar. But what do the Zamindars then do with this power? How is the Zamindari, does Zamindari power actually change as a result of a permanent settlement or the result of other events of the early 19th century? And can you characterize the way Zamindars behave with their Latis according to different types of Zamindar? There are some who are great feudal magnates, there are some who are landlords with a few scattered possessions. It's been argued there's a difference between Eastern and Western Bengal. People who farm demesne land or who have smallholders. I mean, do different types of landlords tend to react, but do they have different types of power and tend to react in different sorts of ways? And the final point, the final context really would be about the one word which I was slightly surprised not to find in the index. There are lots of references to Zamindari, there's reference to mafiosi, there are no references to Jojidars. And what I know about Royal Bengal society in the 19th century is mostly comes from another great shining star of Jadavpur University, Ratna Rai, who was a friend of mine in Cambridge. And I know that the Jojidar thesis is not as compelling as it once was, but there are rich and powerful people in the Bengali countryside who are not zamindar. How do they relate to these structures of power? And particularly as the 19th century wears on, how far does the commercialization of agriculture, the rise of jute cultivation, for example, affect the power, affect, if you like, who has power to get hold of the luckies, who are the effective controllers of the land. In the late 19th century, of course, Indians are characterized, whereas in the early 19th century, as Ranjan has shown, most of the company's subjects are frightened of the courts or run away from the courts. In the late 19th century, officials characterize Indians as being litigious because there are so many cases coming up in the court. And particularly the Tenancy Acts of the 1860s and 1880s suggest that the law becomes a tool which various groups in rural society use against each other and against their rule. And is this again the result of changes in commercialization in agriculture, changes in the social or cultural behavior of zamindari groups, the rise of jojidars, if that exists, increasing administrative competence, or what? So that is the balance of order and disorder in 1900 different from it is in 1860? I mean, Ranjan will argue that this is not his book, but I mean, the question arises, if it is different, why? What has changed? It's not that the colonial state has reformed itself. Is it that change has taken place on the ground, or that economic change or whatever has taken place? I'm not setting out these sort of perspectives. I'm not trying to in any way denigrate the superb work that Ranjan has done in producing this book. I'm just suggesting issues that other people might like to pick up from the mass of material that's in it and take these sorts of arguments one step further. Anyway, thank you very much, Ranjan, for writing the book and for inviting me to introduce it.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Tomlinson. I now invite Professor Anindita Mukhopadhyay to say a few words.
Good evening to my friends, senior colleagues whom I've always looked up to, and good morning to the distinguished panelists who are here and whose especially Professor Tomlinson's works I've read. We also teach Professor Tomlinson, especially his take on the colonial state, the role of the Congress in modern India. Those books actually are, as mentioned before, have been fairly important in the way we actually approach the questions of modern India, modern political organizations, and political consciousness. So I feel very privileged to be part of this panel, and especially to be discussing Ranjan's book, which I have found extremely rich in the way it handles a variety of sources and in the way it lays out some very important arguments on control and authority. Of course, looking at the colonial state in the way it emerges as the dominant player in Bengal, but which also reflects in many ways post-colonial developments in India, and therefore there are continuities with these issues. These are not actually limited to the late 19th century, early, this is not really limited to the 19th century Bengal, but these are actually questions which spill over into a modern political consciousness, and therefore I think it is an extremely important domain of research. Crime and criminality are notions of deviance, and deviance which is laid out as different from the normal. And we find, especially if we keep Professor Tomlinson's opening remarks in place, we find that these norms that are beginning to emerge in the 19th century lays out very clearly the ways in which non-governance, ungovernable communities, non-governance, issues of non-governance, disorder, and dissonance are always posited against obedience, against law-abiding communities, against order, legitimacy of law, the emergence of a certain rhetoric of the importance of the rule of law, and how there are these oppositions that are beginning to play out in the way the colonial administration, the notions of colonial governance, begins to put some very important principles of governance in place, which also is fairly binding by the time we come to the mid 19th century, late 19th century. These rhetoric of governance, these principles, these normative principles which hold together a certain sense of order, has begun to be accepted as fairly hegemonic in the, shall we say, the literate communities, as lodestones in the way governance is seen as a permeating principle in a political, in a increasingly politicized world, in an increasingly increasingly growing political consciousness of Indian subjects who would aspire to be citizens. So it is in this understanding of a certain legitimate frame, a frame of government, which is very, very, I think, deep, which has a very powerful reach across literate communities, but which actually sits very lightly on shall we say, the excluded communities, the non-literate communities like the peasants, who actually experience the operation of law, who actually experience, they do not understand, or shall we say, they are not concerned with the rhetoric of law, with the rhetoric of order, with the rhetoric of the state, but they are much more concerned with the way the state and a new legal order, a new set of institutions begin to lay out a certain experiential framework, which of course becomes very central with land-man relations, right? So this is where the permanent settlement is actually the cornerstone, if you like, of a rural community which experiences change without actually making the conceptual leap into a different understanding of legality, right? So they are subjects, they're not necessarily legal subjects. And there has to be this very important difference between how a subject is enmeshed within a very important legal relationships brought in by the colonial state, but who is not really interested in the conceptualization or the principles which put the colonial state in place in the minds of the literate community. So here I would say there are two Indias that are beginning to emerge. One which experiences the exponentially changing world of disparate economic developments, a sudden spurt in the land market, a sudden swerve in the way rights in land are fought out in courts, and the world which Professor Tomlinson himself has helped us chalk out, which is the world of the Congress, the world of political parties, nationalism, and a new modern India, which is hammered out in this space. These, I would suggest, actually belong to two different domains. And law and order as a rhetoric, and as also as a new principle of government, new principle of a legitimate hook for the state, is actually not really part of the communities that do not share or do not grow or are not educated into these principles, right? So rule of law as a rhetoric, which may mean one thing to the Bhadralok, Bengali Bhadralok, is something which has only oppression, which has legal fraud, false witnesses, and so on and so forth, when it plays out in the lives of the peasants, the riots of Bengal, right? So I think this is what Professor Chakrabarti has done brilliantly in the first two essays, where he actually shows the very different operation of legal institutions and penal institutions that operate as very, very oppressive control mechanisms of the colonial state, without actually offering a conceptual world where these changes can be made sense of, right? So these are, and I think this is where we begin to find India's separating, right? We were talking about South Asian history, right? And this is the point from where our Indias begin to separate, right? The holistic understanding, okay, it was fragmented. There was patriarchy and other kinds of fragmentations that shadowed, that haunted pre-colonial India, but there had been some parity between the way in which territorialities were imagined into the way in which cosmologies were imagined. This is what breaks down precisely at this point, where Indias begin to separate out in very different ways in which rationalizations of oppression, power, authority begin to enable certain communities into moving into the modern world, and other communities actually are victimized by the same colonial structures that strengthen the hands of the feudal elements in rural societies, right? So there is no liberation. There is, in fact, the way in which colonial structures strengthen the hand of rural patriarchies, strengthen the hands of zamindars, strengthen the hands of their lathials, vis-a-vis very, very helpless, tied down riots, peasant community, right? Okay, so this is, and I think this is really, really very well done. So prisons and courts, both civil as well as criminal, actually literally nail these differences between an emerging modern set of literate communities moving into a modern political world where Nehru would be, a superfit, and we have, sinking back into a hierarchical, highly hierarchical, caste-ridden world, sharply punctuated, sharply held up by the legal rights handed on a plate to landed elite, who would in turn have more control over their tenants, their peasant community. And this is where I would say that, Sharachandra Chattopadhyay, quite a lot of literatures, Rabindranath Tagore, of course, right, have actually looked at the way in which the legal apparatus perfected by the colonial state actually strengthened the hands of the indigenous ruling elite, right? Who were subordinate, of course, to the colonial presence, but who were all in all in the rural context, right? Which was not really penetrated by the logic, the rationale of the colonial state. Now, I seem to be talking a lot, so I will try to wind up the discussion, and quickly mention the articles that I found extremely important in order to show the ideology of the colonial state, which of course looked at order, which actually looked at ungovernable communities, and which of course had a very different rationality, which understood criminality, which was different from the way criminality was constructed in the West, and how these principles actually turned into legislations against tribes called, so you have the formulation of the Criminal Tribes Act, which became fairly crucial to the understanding of Oriental, of exotic criminality, right? So these are the ways in which Western intellectual traditions switched, they sort of transformed in the they were applied in the Indian context, right? So you did have the notion of the underbelly, so you were looking at the Luddites, you were looking at Christopher Hill's understanding of the world turned upside down. But nevertheless, these were actually applied in the context of a historical process, which did look at certain kinds of continuities, whereas the frames of redefining criminal communities, and giving them a very different category, giving them a very different, a very different notation, if you like, of criminality, which was different from the Western context, right? So you have the framing of the Criminal Tribes Act. You also have the deployment of administrative strategies, which would locate criminality and community and caste occupation as something which was peculiar to the hierarchical organization specific to the Indian subcontinent, right? So you are actually beginning to see different ways in which Western ideas, different ways in which Western definitions of criminality, crime, state control played out in India. And yet we find, and I found the 6th chapter, dacoity, affray, and violence, very, very rich in the way certain territories, for example, Maiman Singh and Sherpur, as the frontier provinces where control did not really work, actually also resonate with certain kinds of popular perception of criminality, which had absolutely nothing to do with the way the colonial state understood caste and criminality as synonyms, right? So there are these wonderful, folk tales and folk songs coming out from Maiman Singh, which celebrated criminality, a bit like the Robin Hood tales, right? So these were folk songs collected by Dinesh Chandra Sen. And, it was almost as if Ranjan actually provided me with the archival documentation against which these songs, around deviant behavior celebrated in Maiman Singh, right? Becomes fairly central to folk imagination. These are palas, right? These are songs, folk songs that were part of a rural audience and rural singers singing them out, right? Okay, so the definition of criminality, the definition of crime, and of course, the educated communities falling in with this definition was actually totally different from the way popular imagination understood criminality. Popular imagination celebrated criminality and the successful criminal, right? The Dada. And there is, songs which celebrate, which commemorate this living outside the frame of law and order as defined by the state, whatever that may be. It could be the pre-colonial notions of governance, but it could also mean the evasion of colonial state and its hegemonic understanding of order. And so, the questions that rose in my mind seemed very, very similar to the ones that Professor Tomlinson was also turning on, which is that since the colonial administration notions of or shall we say the principles of governance were coming out of the West, but which were actually using indigenous structures to give form to power, to give form. I'm not just talking about Cornwallis's permanent settlement, but we are actually talking about the courts and the jails that had, Indian officials that had, a certain operational legitimacy that used Indian personnel. And therefore, I would say that there was never actually a very clear line drawn between white power, white authority, always, dominant over the Indian population. I would say, and this is of course very well proven in Ranajit, in Ranjit Guha's works. It is actually a gray world where the power, as it materializes, as it shapes into and impacts ordinary people, impacts with the rural countryside, is actually, exponentially deeper, exponentially more powerful because of these very penetrating institutions like law, like new legislative practices, like criminal courts, like jails, but they are actually also put in place by the very groups that have dominated the countryside for centuries, right? And therefore, there is not the Bhadralok's imagination, but there is a certain kind of a continuity in the countryside, which actually perhaps cannot separate the conceptual apparatus of the colonial state and the practical hands that strengthen the colonial state's policies, right? And this is again the tension that is very much present in Ranjan's work, which I have found really, really fascinating, where the worlds merge. There is grayness, right? So it is never actually the colonial state and the oppressed indigenous communities. It is the colonial state, with indigenous elite that oppress marginalized indigenous communities like the peasants, like the criminal tribes, and so on. And this is what emerges in Ranjan's work, which is, disturbing, because we see the problems of modern India. We see the emerging Indias different rhetorical, principles of the new India. And we see these tensions, these social tensions, which will hound us. We are hounded by these social tensions even today. So thank you so much, Ranjanda, for this great book.
Thank you so much, Professor Mukhopadhyay. I now request Professor Suranjan Das to say a few words. Can you hear us?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Well, thank you. I have to address the from the airport. Pardon me for that. Could I first congratulate my time friend, present colleague, producing excellent volume. I also express my gratitude to Primus for once again. It's indeed a pleasure to be in the same panel where Professor Tomlinson is there. And I remember wonderful days that we had in SOAS and other places during my wonderful days at Oxford. It is also a pleasure to have in the panel, I think Anindita was my student. So Anindita, are you my student? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Suranjanda, we attended some of your classes. I went to JNU, but I didn't. Yeah.
Anyway, it's also again a pleasure to be in the same panel with someone who actually attended some of my classes. It's Professor Ronald and Doel. Thank you very much for being in the panel, and thanks Pushun and Jyotika for putting me in the panel. But I'm sorry, as I said, I have to speak from the airport, but I thought I should not lose the opportunity at least to say a few words about the book. I have great respect for Ranjan's scholarship, and the present volume once again demonstrates this expertise of him. Now, the theme of order and disorder in colonial India has been a subject of scholarly attention for decades. And Ranjan, in his apt introduction to the essays, has ably highlighted the main trends in the historiography on this theme. Ranjan himself has contributed richly to this historiography, but as he himself admits, I quote, bulk of this work has been published earlier, unquote. But while bringing these articles together, he has not only revised them, but have arranged them thematically in a way that it looks like a monograph. That, I think, is a unique feature of the volume. Ranjan deserves our heartiest congratulations for this. I shan't take much of your time, but would like to make some comments on the volume section concerning disorder. In delineating what I would call the dialectics of order and disorder in early colonial Bengal, Ranjan has neatly divided the volume into two parts. In the first part, the chapters deal with essentially the parameters of colonial order, including colonial perceptions of crime and criminality, while the last two chapters, one on dacoity and another on anatomy of violence, deal with disorder. I'd like to submit some of my comments on the disorder part of the volume, disorder section of the volume. Now, in his introductory essay, Ranjan demonstrates how the scholarship on crime and criminality in Indian history has considerably drawn upon the Western scholarship. But you have yet to develop a comparative conceptual framework in understanding the contours of what in colonial discourse is called crime and criminality. For instance, one finds considerable similarity in perceptions of the ruling authority in England itself about the recalcitrant social groups categorized as outcasts and dangerous, and the Raj in India. And this issue needs to be discussed to what extent colonial perception to outcasts in India reflected the perceptions of the authority in the colonial metropolis itself. There is considerable literature to show how widespread fear following the garroting panic in 19th century London presaged a considerable extension of police powers in Britain and effectively silenced any opposition to the whole idea of an overpowering English police force. We need to explore if the same process was experienced in colonial Bengal. Ranjan refers to the rights of dacoities in colonial Bengal. But was there any particular pattern for this? In my own study on Bengal dacoities, I found there was no fixed pattern. And in that context, we need to ask what was the historical context, social or political, in the forms of rituals associated with dacoities. The other theme which needs to be explored in studying dacoities in rural Bengal is what I call the differing perceptions of the dacoits at the popular level and the police level. The perceptions at the two levels were not always the same. I have come across references where personalities categorized as dacoits by the police are hailed as protectors and deliverers at the popular level. This aspect needs to be addressed. Ranjan has focused essentially on aspects of rural crime, but colonial Bengal also witnessed newer forms of urban crime, and I hope that Ranjan will look at this in his later works, perhaps comparing the trends and contexts with the rural scene. I had the opportunity to work on the Calcutta Gundas on based on the hitherto unutilized, at least on the then hitherto unutilized Gunda files. And this I found fascinating. Here also, I found the colonial perception about Gundas in India, the so-called Calcutta underworld, was largely shaped by the perceptions of the British ruling class to events happening in Britain itself. Scholars like Gamini Salgado have shown how the term hooligan in England registered an abrupt entry into English vocabulary during what is known as the hot summer of 1898 to describe the rowdy youth. But as with Gunda and Gundaism in India, the official and media discourses in England turned hooligan and hooliganism to terms of general notoriety so that they became controlling words for any unexplained crime. Not unnaturally, very often personalities involved in Indian nationalist politics or Indian popular politics or Indian protest politics who could not be otherwise jailed by the existing provisions of the various acts by the colonial authorities were promptly categorized as gundas and imprisoned under the Gunda Act. I was wondering if such processes were at work in the case of rural dacoities. As we increasingly see crime as a form of defiance, and the social group involved in these activities did not only come from deprived categories. As I have tried to show in the case of the Gundas, I am reminded of a pertinent remark of Karl Marx, and I quote, "The criminal produces not only crimes, but also criminal law." And with this, the professor who gives lectures on criminal law. The criminal produces not only crimes, but also criminal law. And with this, the professor who gives lectures on criminal law. I do not know whether Ranjan has derived inspiration from this quote, but Ranjan, in the two chapters on disorder, has aptly demonstrated that crime has a social aspect of protest, and it does not represent the act of an individual, but represents a trend against dominant exploitative conditions. And in doing that, Ranjan has provided new entry points to study crime and criminality in early colonial Bengal, and I hope future researchers will fruitfully utilize these turning points, these entry points, and enrich the historiography of crime and criminality, not only in Bengal, but of India. Congratulations, Ranjan, and congratulations, Primus, for yet another very fruitful academic exercise and presenting the reading public with a wonderfully produced book. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much.
Since Professor Dash is to catch a flight, so I don't know whether I'll get the opportunity to respond to his beautiful comments. Can you give me a couple of minutes, maybe 1 minute?
Of course, please.
Yes,
Actually,
please.
thank you very much, Suranjan da, for your very useful comments on the book. Yes, I agree with you. There was no fixed pattern of dacoity. Never ever any fixed pattern of dacoity in the case of 19th century rural Bengal. But some of the dacoities, interestingly, they do conform with the Hobsbawm model of social banditry. For example, they are very few in number. For example, Vishwanath Sardar's uprising. He fought against the indigo planters, European indigo planters, and the support base for him started growing rapidly. The entire rural society became involved with that bandit hero. But these are very unusual cases. There are not too many such cases which conform to the social banditry model. Absolutely right. I agree with you. I did not bring in urban crime, Suranjan, because I stopped at 1860. I benefited immensely from your book as well as your article published in EPW, the article titled Behind the Blackened Faces. But you are dealing with the urban, mostly with the urban dacoits and the gundas, the dacoits or the lawbreakers whom you call the gundas. But as I stopped in 1860, I did not go beyond 1860. I do not get much opportunity to study the urban crime because urbanization was not yet complete at that time. And you are right. I mean, there are other areas which can be opened up in future, particularly the second part. It could have been further taken to the early 20th century. I mean, the entire 19th century could have been covered, but that it was not possible for me to do that. Maybe in future, I shall try to do that, or some other researchers may undertake this job. Thank you. Thank you, Suranjan, for your comments.
Yes, we're very thankful for Professor Das for joining us, even though he had a flight to catch. So I now invite our final discussant for this evening, Professor Ronald Doel, to say a few words.
Thank you so much, and thanks again, Ranjan, for making this possible, and the good folks at Primus, and all colleagues and friends who are joining in. I'm aware of our time, and I come at this not only from North America, but as a historian of science and environmental history who looks at a later period of time. So I wanted to raise a, I think, slightly different set of issues, segue into what I hope can be a larger discussion of this really good and important work that we have. And Professor Tomlinson, I saw not too long ago an article that you had written back in 1975 that was calling for precisely this kind of work that Ranjan took on, that we didn't understand these social dimensions. And one of the real contributions, Ranjan, that you make in the introduction is setting this up in the larger context of thinking about social history and those larger ways that we can understand the past. What are the appropriate good questions we can be asking? And I think you did a very effective and good job in pointing out, and I stress this in part for the younger historians who are part of this group listening, how many decades it's taken to begin to get a sense of what we know about these very important issues that have only really been the focus of work over the past few decades. And Ranjan, you pointed out that studies of bandits are still relatively rare in North America and in major parts of Western Europe. And one of the things your book does is point as a roadmap to a lot of questions that still need to be raised in many contexts, in many periods of time. What I wanted to also raise is how effective your book is in the way that you have written it. And one of the questions in the chat is about audiences and its levels of experience and how to understand this kind of work. One of the things, Ranjan, that I think you have done so well in this book and indeed throughout your larger body of work is respect what a number of people, including the anthropologist Clifford Geertz, spoke about with thick description, providing the rich archival evidence, the level of detail that helps to make particular stories convincing. And one of the hidden sets of hidden gems, I think, that run through your book are the allusions that you make. In many cases, you don't follow as far as perhaps some of your colleagues here on the panel would like. But I'm thinking, for instance, and it's in the penultimate chapter of your current book here, where you mention that bandits had an impact on the thinking of Mao Zedong. And the reader is left with understanding that one's talking about a relationship between issues you're raising here and the rise of the People's Republic of China in the middle of the 20th century. There are numerous instances of those insights that you're raising throughout the book. And I do want to thank you for the way that you have addressed these questions. And let me quickly segue into what I hope may be a larger discussion. I think we don't often have the chance to ask authors what surprised them the most in the midst of this research. What wasn't part of your expectations? What rose? What did you have to particularly struggle with because it was so unexpected as you continued, as you modified the work that you were doing? I think it's helpful, particularly for the younger historians listening in, to share what were the greatest challenges, or what became perhaps one of the unexpected joys of working out the arguments that you had in this book. And finally, I'm curious, Ranjan, you mentioned briefly in your own introduction the way that your work in environmental history influenced your thinking about the social history at the heart of the current study. I'd like to hear more about that. I'd like to hear if that also influenced your attention to the architecture of the prisons and the impact that this had on the on those who were involved in this system through the 19th century. And just to pull us back into the book, the cover shows a photograph that comes in part from environmental history. And I'm curious, perhaps, if there's a story behind the image that got chosen for the introduction. But I want to end and simply thank you for giving us not only this rich work, but the opportunity here to have this kind of large cross-continental discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Doel. We now have time for a few questions. So the first question is for Professor Chakrabarti by Orpo Chaudhary, and he asks, "Sir, was the idea of criminality homogeneous to the British in India? And if not, how far did they differentiate between the criminality of the white and with that of the Indians?" Professor Chakrabarti?
Jyotika, we can take the questions together, some of the questions together. We can club some of them. Please talk about the other questions. I could not follow this particular question, the first one. Could you repeat this?
I'll repeat it, sir. Was the idea of criminality homogeneous to the British in India? If not, how far did they differentiate between the criminality of the white with that of the Indians?
Okay, I quickly respond to this. Well, criminality of the white, that can be dealt with separately. In fact, one of my PhD students, I'm sure that she's here in the audience today among the participants, Dr. Sharmishta Dey. She worked on the criminality of the whites, the white underworld. Her book has been widely acclaimed. It is a different subject, and it's quite a different issue altogether. But there were white criminals in the port towns, particularly in Bombay and also in Calcutta. and I did not deal with this. I left it out because it has to be taken up separately. So that is my response to the first question. Quick response. We can come back to this question later on if necessary.
All right. So there are...
Ranjan, can I make a comment? Can I
please,
make
please,
a comment,
Ranjan,
Jyotika?
please.
Yes, just before I board the plane, I once again congratulate Ranjan. Now, the question of ritual that I raised is important because, you know, in the studies that I had done, I've seen even Muslim dacoits were performing Kali Puja. That is very significant. Muslim dacoits performing Kali Puja, performing Hindu rituals. And again, I mean, I have found Hindu dacoits also sometimes performing Muslim rituals. So this sort of intersectionality perhaps needs to be delved in further, to get a broader picture of the rural society as it evolved in colonial Bengal, because we did not take into as a given fact the divisions of society along religious lines. The second point, Ranjan, in Western discourse, a term is now being widely used, which is called the geography of crime and criminality. Why is it that within a particular geographical location, crime and criminality is more present than other areas? So this notion of geographical criminality, the geography of crime, if it can be integrated in studies of crime, perhaps that could throw a new dimension. That were the two important comments that I wanted to make.
This geography of crime, Suranjan, it is there. I have dealt with, though briefly. I have referred to it. I have discussed the perception of crime, Indian perception of crime. The colonial rulers continuously tried to display that in India, everything is different. It is the other. It is the other, and even crime is different. And here the criminals are hereditary. They take their training in crime from their parents. This is particularly applicable to the Thogis, and they also identified other different subgroups of criminals in the Indian context, and they tried to show Indian crime as completely qualitatively different from the Western parameters of crime. And Kali Puja also I dealt with.
Not only that, yes. Not only that, Ranjan, we can also integrate the notion of colonial anthropology in understanding colonial perception, because I have come across a number of documents where the officials say who is a criminal, who is a dacoit. A dacoit should have a monkey-like face with broad teeth, with long fingers. So these were the colonial stereotypical images which made the colonial officials, particularly at the village and district level, to randomly categorize groups as criminal tribes, all criminals.
Thank you, Suranjan. I shall discuss this point later with you.
Sure.
And we can perhaps in future we can think of bringing out another volume on this together.
Best of luck for you. Best of luck for you.
But I want you with me. I want you with me in this project.
Luck. Thank you.
Suranjanta and Ranjanta, but this can I just chip in for a second, because this will address both your comments. Well, caste-oriented crime, community-oriented crime, not just hereditary familial occupation, but caste, but entire communities, right? Which is completely different from the Western individualistic notion of, a man being a sinner, right? But not necessarily coming from a criminal background, or there is a lot of responsibility which is thrust on the Western individual for his or her criminal behavior, which is just not the case in the assumptions that colonial anthropology makes about Indian criminality, right? Okay. There is some reflection of your findings, Professor Das, which looks at Muslims and Hindu dacoits performing rituals together, right? So there is a certain, shall we say, a certain community which is not ordained, or which is not confined to a religious identity or a religious location. There is, in a way, a sharing, if you like, of a way of life, where rituals are intersecting different religious orders, right? Okay. But this is not perceived by the colonial definition as something which is breaking their stereotypes, right? They would always turn on a caste, on a casteist definition of this kind of disparate communities, this kind of disparate elements within a certain, say, a certain underworld. India is being constructed by stereotypes. The saddest part is that the educated communities begin to share these stereotypes and begin to build their world. You just have to look at the early 20th century Bengali writers, and you will see that they're literally spitting out these colonial characteristics, right? You know, anthropological assumptions, notions of criminality coming out from the lower castes and so on. So it is actually a very, very strange new kind of modernity, which is being crisscrossed by colonial assumptions on criminality. So this is something which perhaps we really need to move very deeply into in order to maybe get behind our own modernity, our own political subjectivities, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Anindita, that was the point that I wanted to make. And we need to make a comparative study, say studies between criminality in colonial Bengal with criminality within courts in, say, in South India, West India, or Northern India. Then we can get a clear picture of how certain colonial perceptions completely defined the way the term crime was defined, criminals were defined, and tribes were categorized.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Ranjan, I have to catch the flight. Thank you very much.
Yes, and thank you, Suranjan. Thank you, Suranjan.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a safe flight. Have a safe flight.
Bye.
It was a pleasure hearing you, Suranjan.
Thank you. We continue the discussion about university administration later on.
Of course.
See you. Bye.
Bye.
Have a safe journey.
Okay, so now we have two questions that are you could respond to them together. So the first one is, can violence used by some elements of Indian society be considered a form of defiance? And the second question, which is similar, is, how can ideas of disorder and resistance be seen as tools of justice in the perspective of the marginalized mind?
Yes, for example, I give you a concrete example from my book itself. Dacoity. Dacoities were used both by the landlords. The landlords committed dacoities. And, dacoity was a very convenient technique in the 19th century rural society to coerce their opponents. Dacoity to many was a means of livelihood. We find that poorer people without any means resorting to dacoity or violence to earn their life. That is there. At the same time, we find dacoities were used by landlords to destroy their adversaries, their enemies. So, and yes, coming to the second question, we find that dacoity was a form of protest. It was used as a form of protest. Dacoity is a term which is misleading. In the colonial records, when I went through the colonial records, we find that the social protest movements, they were lost because the colonial authorities, the colonial police, the administrators, the civilians, they could not understand the exact character of the violence. Many of these violent episodes had their roots in agrarian discontent, but they were branded as dacoities, as heinous offenses, as violent and heinous offenses. They could not understand the agrarian origins of those discontents. So it has been happening all through the early 19th century. and even beyond. And Anindita made a very interesting point when she was speaking this evening. She said that there are continuities. Even today, the Bengal rural society, or maybe the rural societies of other parts of India, they remain more or less the same in more ways than one. We find similarities, even after so many 100 years, even after 200 years, we find the pattern of the structure of violence, which sometimes erupt in different parts of India, particularly in the rural societies, they remain more or less the same. So this is a point which should be continued, pursued, and explored by researchers, that how much the Indian society has changed. There are continuities as well as changes, certainly, but these things should be explored in far more detail.
Ranjan, can I just chip in for a second to buttress your own point? You see, because your question is very important, violence in rural areas, if you actually look at Ranjan's work on the permanent settlement, and there has been a lot of other works on the permanent settlement, where there is a very new land-man relationship emerging with a new kind of land market, which is actually strengthened by colonial institutions, legal and penal institutions, courts and jails, right? Okay. And we find that, and I really think that this is the root of our troubles, right? Where there is a sinking back into a peculiarly hierarchical caste structure, which is strengthened by colonial institutions, right? The peasantry actually cannot fight back because they are deprived. They're deprived of all the mobility they had in the pre-colonial, colonial administrative systems. The Nawabis or the Hindu Rajas, right? Where at least the peasants, if they were cornered too much, actually made a run for it, right? But in the colonial times, they were mired back into the land, right? They really could not escape, and therefore the the structure, the caste structure, if you like, the hierarchical order of the rural, landed society, which whether you like Marxism or not, will have to be described as feudal, right? It is a feudalistic order, right? Which is strengthened by modern, state machinery, right? Okay, so it becomes exponentially far more powerful, right? With the landed elite actually being entrenched into their positions with these modern, interventions. If the peasants do not like it, Bankim Chandra actually said that, if you think that, you have lost your land and you would like to go to the court, kindly think the better of it and go get yourself a big earthenware pot and a long length of rope and go and drown yourself, because that is actually a far better solution than going to the court, right? So there is this encasing of the peasantry within a very, very exploitative modern, that is very important, a modern state structure, exploitative in the pre-colonial sense, but a modern state structure which strengthens the pre-colonial relationships, land-man relationships, and they're up the wall, and there is no other way to break out of it but through violence, right? Violence is the only way. What do? This is Ranajit Guha, right? Okay, so you do need to understand the primordial categories of violence which characterizes upsurges from below. Sorry.
This is a very important point, Anindita, you raised, and many of the panelists this evening raised. I think now we have to question our modernity.
Yes.
This modernity after the rise of parliamentary democracy and the multi-party system, how much all these trends which disturb the Bengal rural society in the past, how much they are further refurbished in the modern context. That is a very crucial question which is coming up. And you are right, Anindita, I agree with you.
Thank you. Actually, I shouldn't be saying this, but Bollywood has also addressed this. Think of all the Thakurs in all the Bollywood movies. That is not
Absolutely.
hierarchy.
Absolutely.
Aren't
Very
they strengthened
hierarchical.
by the courts and the jails and the police? Well,
Yes. Yes. Thank you.
So Dr. Kasturi Ghosh has actually left 3 questions for Professor Chakrabarti. So I'll read them all out. So the first is, how would you place the Foucauldian model of discipline and punish, if at all, in the context of early colonial Bengal? The second part is, though this is outside your research timeline, do you think that the old Alipur jail was more an instrument to bring order or that of meting out punishments? And then connected to the second question is, did this ordering target only the issue of criminality, or were the issues of madness and otherization given equal attention?
Thank you, Kasturi, for your questions. Very good questions. And but the 3 in number, very difficult to keep track one after another. You see, the Alipur jail and all jails certainly symbolized colonial power. It was an institution to punish the criminals. It was to infuse just measure, Benthamite concept of just measure of pain. The prisoners were kept in the prison for a definite period of time according to the verdict given by the court, and its primary job was to reform the criminal and bring out the human, transform the human. The criminal was a human being, and the human elements, they should be brought out from the person. He should be reformed. You know, the prisons were called penitentiary. They were house of reform. Some kind of reformation was expected. They would undergo some kind of a reformation, and then they would come as real human beings. They would be taught industrious activities, and that was the idea behind penitentiary, if you look at the theoretical side of penitentiary. But above all, it was a symbol of colonial power. And as Foucault said, you know, all these institutions, the prison, the hospital, the army, barrack, they were all symbols of power, and they were exercising power at different layers of the society. And Foucault can be of some help, certainly, though only conceptually. Foucault did not work on colonial Bengal. Foucault's books do not have any element or any information about colonial Bengal. He did not have colonial Bengal in mind when he authored Discipline and Punish. It was basically a critique of European modernity. What Foucault was doing, in Foucault, we have a rejection of modernity. Whatever was modern, considered to be modern, in Michel Foucault, we find a complete rejection, wholesale rejection of that modernity. And what was the other question? I missed the track. What was another question?
Sorry, the last question, sir, was, did this ordering in the Alipur jail target only issues of criminality, or were issues of madness and otherization given equal attention?
No, there was a mental asylum as well.
Yes.
It was separate. That was separate. But basically the issues were same. We have very good works on the mental asylums. One is by Waltraud and the other is by Devjani Das. They have written on the mental asylums. But that is a different subject. But if you look at the philosophical premises, they are connected, certainly connected.
So our final question for this evening is from Subrata Mukhopadhyay, and he is from the chemistry faculty of Jadavpur University, and he's asking, as a student of science, I believe he's asking about the implications of the volume outside, say, the field of history. How would it be relevant to, say, a student of science, or someone who is not a student of history or in the field of history?
No, what is the question?
The question is essentially how he could enrich himself and what are the implications, if there are implications of this volume outside the field of history itself.
Yes, it is Subroto. Thank you for raising this question. He's one of my esteemed colleagues at Jadavpur University. He's a very well-known scientist. Professor Subroto is a very well-known scientist. His works have been widely acclaimed across the world. And thanks for asking question. You see, it is for general readers. General readers can certainly benefit from this. If you want to understand today's society, today's police and prison and governance, this book can be of some help to all of you. You will enjoy reading the book. It has a storytelling character also. This book, I believe, has a storytelling character. You will come to know about the bandit heroes and how the society supported them. Different sections of the society extended their support to these bandit heroes. So you may find it interesting. But it is an exercise in sociology. It is a history and sociology of socio-political crime and also other crimes. So I'm sure that you will love to read it. Thank you for asking the question. And I would like to quickly respond to Professor Doel's question. You see, most people, the practitioners of my discipline, know me as an environmental historian. But he asked that question, how I can connect the two. You know what happened when I was working on this book on crime and criminality of colonial India? I was yet to embark on environmental history. My colleagues at SOAS in the University of London, Professor David Arnold, I don't know whether he has joined this evening, he's with us today. Professor Arnold, Dr. Dawood Ali, Peter Robb, Dr. Bhaskar Mukhopadhyay, who now teaches in the Goldsmith College. They all they were asking about, what about forest crime? What about forest crime? How do you deal with the poachers? Because the colonial state treated them as criminals because they violated the forest laws. They were killing animals. They were cutting trees. But in reality, they were trying to earn their livelihood from the forests. So how would you treat them? How would you accommodate them under your work? This question, I was very intrigued by this question, and this question kept me on my toes for quite a few years. And then I switched over to environmental history. That's how I started my works on environmental history, on forest crime, and some of the issues are forthcoming. It is there in the forthcoming book which Jyotika showed us, the jacket of the book. She showed all of us the climate calamity and the why. The part of the second part of the book, where I dealt with the why, may answer some of these questions. I mean, what to do with the forest crimes and how the forest became imperative for the colonial state to order the forest as well, not only the villages and the cities and towns, but it also became imperative to control the forest space, the wild. That is how I started doing environmental history, and now I am doing environmental history. Thank you, Ron, for this very good question.
So we have a few more questions come in.
Yes, and I quickly respond to Tom. Jyotika, give me 1 minute.
Of course.
Professor Tom, you raised very important questions. A critique. You presented a critique of my book. I appreciate your points, and I agree with you. I agree with most of your points, but you know, many of the questions could not be taken forward because of the simple reason that the book stops in the year 1860. A lot of new things were coming up. A lot of new trends were unfolding after 1860. 1860 till 1860, it was a company, East India Company state. It was not a full-fledged state. It was never a full-fledged state. It was just in a rudimentary shape. The colonial state was in a rudimentary shape. And I was trying to argue in this book, my main point was that Bengal remained the most under-governed space in colonial India, even after 1860. It was there was a minimum government in Bengal. In Bengal, there was feudal control. Feudal control is more prominent. Most of the administrative business was done through the landlords, the zamindars. And it was a peculiar fusion of vernacular and the foreign without any symbiotic relationship. You know, the indigenous structure was retained. At the same time, a colonial structure was superimposed. And it had its impact on colonial state formation. This is precisely why Bengal remained very feudal in character, and it retarded the growth of capitalism and centralized control. Whereas if you look at Punjab, things were different, because Punjab, you know, when it came under colonial governance, it was at a much later period. Yeah. So in Punjab, it became, it was a case of capitalist farming, capitalist agriculture, more centralized control, because the English utilitarians were more powerful by then. Do you get my point, Tom?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, I agree with you. You raised very important critical questions can be dealt with.
Yeah, but it's the late 18th century
yes.
The crucial period.
Professor Chakrabarti, going back to your point about forest crime, I'd like you to refer to Sahara Ahmed's book, which we published a couple of years back, on exactly this theme. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I have seen Sahara Ahmed. I have seen it. Good.
Yes, so Kunal Haldar asked Professor Chakrabarti, why specifically the first half of the 19th century as the time frame for your work?
Yes, it's simply because I was trying to focus on the early colonial state, when the company government was gradually unfolding, and the first, for the first time, the court, a codified law was coming up. The regulations were passed. I was trying to locate the interactions between the rise of a foreign structure of governance and the indigenous society. That is simply the reason, because after 1860, things became different, as Professor Tomlinson rightly pointed out today.
And our last question, I believe, for this evening is, how has criminality impacted contemporary society? And is there any connection between criminality and confinement, so to say?
Connection between criminality and confinement?
Confinement, yes.
Confinement means imprisonment. I don't get the question. I'm sorry, I don't get the question. Not clear to me.
And the first part of the question is, sir, how has criminality impacted contemporary society?
Okay. Crime is always there in all societies. I dealt with history of deviance. I'm trying to map out how society is looking at the criminals and how criminals are becoming criminals. You know what happens? You find that legislators constantly extend the frontier of law, bringing under its purview new human behaviors, new human gestures, certain gestures which were not considered to be criminal earlier. After the legislators enact new laws, those behaviors become criminal actions. Criminality, you know, it is a concept. It is an existentialist concept. It exists because law looks upon certain individual behavior as crime, and that is the beginning of the word criminality. This is criminality. We try to label certain human actions as criminal behavior. And it happens because of the passing of new laws. So it has happened all through human society. We try to discipline and pacify the society. We try to include new human behavior. We try to brand them as criminal action. So that is the relationship between society and criminality. Is that the answer to your question? I don't know. I'm not sure.
Thank you for answering all those questions, sir. I now invite Dr. Prasun Chatterjee to give the vote of thanks and conclude this wonderful and very thoughtful, thought-provoking evening.
Tika, can you once more, before Prasun delivers the formal vote of thanks, can you please show that jacket of my forthcoming book to the viewers once more? Yeah.
This is the book that is forthcoming. We hope to see it in.
Okay.
Very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jyotika. And I hope we all liked the cover of that book. It's a wonderful visual for climate calamity and the wild. But from Primus Books, I would first like to thank all the audience, all in the audience, and the panelists who have actively joined in the discussion of order and disorder in early colonial Bengal. We hope the audience, the people in the audience, the readers, like reading the book as much after these observations by the scholars in the panel, since we have now heard about views on the political culture, as well as the spatial, psychological, and other aspects of detention and imprisonment. On this occasion, I would like to thank Mr. Shugat Jain, the managing director of Primus Books and Ratnasagar Books, who follows and supports his father, Dr. Dharmesh Jain's vision, and whose constant support and encouragement, even during these trying times of the pandemic, has helped us keep our publishing quality research and to keep bringing them to the readers. I would like to now thank our eminent panelists, Professor Suranjan Dash, Professor B R Tomlinson, Professor Anindita Mukhopadhyay, and Professor Ronald Doel for their insights and balanced observations on this topic, which now seems that there are many possibilities of future research emanate from this. And I would also like to thank Professor Ranjan Chakrabarti for publishing with Primus Books, entrusting his innovative work of research with us. And I hope we have been able to do justice to this exciting book in terms of the editorial and production quality. And I hope that we are able to publicize this work to bring attention to its potential. We are grateful to also Mr. B N Verma, head and founding editor of Primus Books, for being here with us today. Thank you all for gathering here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Prashant.
Thank you. Yes, Jyotika.
Thank you very much, Prashant, for inviting me
Thank you,
as a
Anindita.
panelist. It was wonderful, really
Thank
wonderful. And I have never seen Professor Tomlinson in person, so I'm feeling very privileged to finally put a face to the books I teach. And thank you, Ron, for giving a very different tilt to Ranjan's book, and that was actually very insightful. You know, the absences, the kind of questions which you thought were possibly teasers, right? Which which Ranjan sort of kind of came in a circle, came to it in a different way. So yeah, I thought that was a very, very sharp question. And Ranjanda, of course, your book was, as usual, thought-provoking. I enjoyed reading it very much.
Thank
Can
you.
I just,
Thank you.
sorry, can I just say thank you to everyone for taking part. It's been a very interesting, very stimulating occasion, coming in the middle of a warm summer's afternoon in Glasgow. Thank you very much.
Tom, we shall be in touch. We shall
Okay,
be
that's good.
in touch, and we will drag you to more such programs in near future.
Okay.
And we will also discuss our project. And don't forget what Mr. Verma told you.
Yes,
Give
yes,
one of your manuscripts to
Yeah,
Primus.
yeah, okay. It's certainly a very well-made book.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. Okay, so let's, Jyotika.
Thank you.
Thank you, Proshun.
Let's
It was
discuss.
wonderful. Thank you so
Thank
much.
Thank you, Ron.
Thank you so
I
much.
hope you had a good breakfast, Ron, this morning.
We'll have one soon.
Yeah. Nice to see you. We'll be in touch shortly.
We'll be in touch.
Yes.
Thank you, everyone, for this wonderful
Thank
event.
you.
Good evening.
Good.